Hello, all, and welcome to Bennis Stories, a series of interviews with people who knew, loved, were influenced by, worked with, wrote with, were students and mentees of Warren Bennis. This is Kate Bennis, Warren's daughter. This series is created for the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati's Lindner College of Business. My partner in this endeavor is Betsy Myers. Betsy was a dear friend and colleague of Dad's and worked with him at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government as its executive director. She has also been a senior advisor to both President Clinton and President Obama. Today, Betsy and I are delighted to welcome Pat Zigarmi. As we hear, Pat spent the entire academic year of 1972, one of Dad's first years at UC, from 6 a.m. until probably midnight, observing Dad at the University of Cincinnati, researching change leadership for her PhD dissertation. Dr. Zigarmi is a founding associate and senior consulting partner for Blanchard. She's a highly regarded management consultant and best-selling author and an experienced businesswoman. Respected for her abilities to listen and build trust, Pat has been a business consultant to hundreds of managers and executives. For nearly 2 decades, she was Blanchard's vice president of business development. Pat is the senior author of SLII, or maybe that's SL2, Blanchard's flagship product, and authored Leadership Point of View, Leading People Through Change, Adapting to Change, and Building Trust. These products are used across the world in Blanchard's work with most Fortune 500 and multinational companies. She is an expert in leadership and change management. Pat co-authored Leadership and the 1 Minute Manager with Ken Blanchard and Drea Zigarmi, Leading at a Higher Level with all Blanchard founders, and Who Killed Change with John Britt, Ken Blanchard, and Judd Hoekstra. Please welcome Pat Zigarmi. Hello, Pat. I'm so glad to see you. Betsy and I are thrilled to have you here. And we want to hear, first of all, just how you knew Dad. How did you meet him? And what was that? Yeah, how did you begin to know him?
I had read some of his early work on group dynamics and organizational behavior, leading change, probably at Northwestern. And then I went to work for a United States Senator from New York, and Warren was the acting provost at SUNY Buffalo. So it was 1970, and I phoned him to gain his insights on the student and war protests that were going on at Buffalo, since the senator was going to visit the campus, and made the connection, like, you're the Warren Bennis that I studied, right? And he said, yeah. And about the same time, he was also applying to be the president of Northwestern University, which is where I just graduated. So I sort of acted as kind of still knew enough people there to say, I wasn't really an advisor, but as he would test what was going on with me. And then he ultimately wrote about it. And we agreed to meet for dinner the next time. He was in Washington, D.C., and became friends, and he became my mentor. I think when I was doing some reflecting before this podcast, it was like he believed in me and thought I was smart. And from that point on, it really changed my life. Let me share a couple of ways he did that. He invited me to join his leadership team at Cincinnati. I declined. I was in my first year of graduate school, UMass. But he's not someone to take no easily. So he created another opportunity for me and my new husband, Drea. And that was to shadow him for a year in his role as the president of the University of Cincinnati. He secured us a small grant. I think it was like $5,000 for the whole year. And it was enough for us to move to Cincinnati at that time and to shadow him and spend a year doing kind of ethnographic research, just trailing him. And our deal, and that's kind of when I got to know you, Kate, the first time, was that we were in every meeting for that entire year. We read every piece of correspondence that went in and out of the president's office. We reviewed his phone logs, which he agreed to keep for us. So he kept track of who we talked to. And we agreed to give him no feedback. It was amazing because it took incredible ego strength. And he didn't make it through the whole year. He made it till October. Like, we started in September, and there was a seminar that day with the president of Volvo. And so it was late. It was 10:30 at night. We were still in his office. The president of Volvo had left, and he said, "So what are you learning?" And we said, "Yeah, not the deal." Because everything that we were doing to gain access to the faculty and to students and to administrators was based on the fact that we weren't sharing anything. So we said, no deal. And he backed off. And we went on to spend that year really giving him no feedback, but watching him day in and day out from September until probably July. And then my dissertation became a study of how he led change at the University of Cincinnati. And I was thinking back when I was preparing for this, that was 50 years ago this year. I mean, it's literally, my dissertation was in 1974. Drea wrote his dissertation about how the president of a university is a boundary person. The outside organizations think that the president is in charge because they're used to hierarchical organizations. Little did they know the president can get very little done in a university because the faculty doesn't really report to them. So Drea wrote this dissertation on the president of a university being a boundary person and mediating and trying to negotiate and influence demands from the outside inside the organization. And mine was a study of how he led change.
So
were you with him like every day? Like, how did that work? You guys were
every day.
Was both of you followed him around every day, or would like one of you went to all his meetings, all his social events like that?
Yeah, we were often with him from 6 a.m. until 11 at night. I think I ate dinner at the Bennis house probably 5 nights a week because Warren really opened his house. He had a university house and it was big and welcoming, and he had a team that could support the kind of conversations that he liked to have. And so I was often at the house for dinner, and the days were really long. And of course, he didn't stop working on the weekends. And so, yeah, it was both of us. Okay. We kept, at that point in time, we recorded some meetings, and particularly we recorded our interviews with other people. But with him, we kept handwritten notes at that point in time. And we could actually tell when he was under stress by how often he smoked, because he smoked at that time. So we kept track. We had a little symbol that we used for when he smoked. And then we could go back and analyze like where he was really under pressure. But yeah, we were in every meeting, and most of the time, both of us.
So what I want to ask, first of all, how many packs did he actually smoke? I thought he smoked like 3 packs a day sometimes. Is that right?
Sometimes I think he smoked, 2 or 3 packs a day.
He was really a bad smoker.
You know?
Yeah. And then the other question I had is, what were the dinners like?
They were just fun. I was starting to think about his gifts. And I think one of the gifts I would call out is that I thought he was a world-class conversation convener. That was the words that came up, is he could set the table and get other people to talk. And so dinners were really fun at your house. It was fun. It's fun to hear people get asked a question, and then he just gave them the space to respond. Some of the people that he brought in were all of the people in my field, his co-authors from the past. There's always Bennis, Benny, and Chin, and Benny and Chin were there, and Edgar Schein was there. And it was like going to a graduate seminar for me. And those were his peers, those were his colleagues. And so after the development stuff was on, the people that he'd had the seminar for, the other university administrators left. It was like sitting in on a seminar with, or a colloquium with the people that you most admired in your field. So it was casual, it was relaxed, and it was just world-class conversation. And largely because of Warren being able to pose an amazing question.
So how do you think he treated people? And this is only because I've heard of this from other students who were driving him at the time and living at our house. It seems to me like he treated people equally, interestingly, even though there were some esteemed colleagues there that he would ask you to add your.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. There was a real equality. That's something I hadn't called out, but I think it's one of his gifts, is that I had no sense that I was less than or a student of or not a peer of. He treated people with real respect, whether it just didn't matter who they were. They had an opinion. That's one of his gifts, I think, is bringing in other people's voices to conversations. But I was also thinking of what else he was a noticer. He used that phrase in one of his books, a world-class noticer, but he was a world-class noticer. Like he had an amazing power of observation. So again, he would set the table, but he would be really present and observe. It wasn't like he distanced himself. He was watching, and he was often the one that was prompting where the conversation would go. And I think that was also one of his gifts. He was a synthesizer. I was looking back at how many of his books are really interviews that he did. And what was missing as I went back over all those books over the last couple of weeks was he didn't often write about himself. He didn't often write about his experience, like a memoir or an autobiography. It was really, he was using his experience clearly as the springboard to ask the questions, the really good questions. But so many of his books are really interviews. And he had, I think, an amazing knack for making connections that other people didn't see. So he would interview 60 people in a CEO position or in a leadership position, and then he would make those connections that the rest of us wouldn't necessarily make. And that was one of his gifts.
Yeah.
He was, a phrase I wrote down is he had a hungry mind. He was constantly curious about anyone who was in his space or around him or who was leading another organization. And during those years, Kate, when we were at your house or in his office, I just experienced him as dedicated. He was really dedicated to his work. Witness how many hours we worked and shadowed him. He was generous. He was just open-hearted and open his house and his office and his mind. I found him humble. Some people would probably not find him humble, but I found him humble given the success he'd had and would have. I found him open. He was playful. When he asked us to share what we were learning, it was done with a little like mischievousness. And like he knew we weren't going to do it, but he was going to test us. Yeah, he was an extraordinary person to have as my mentor. I mean, him and Kim Blanchard would be the people that really changed who I was.
Did you and Drea meet at Ken's house or something?
Yes, we met at Ken's house. Yes. I was the one who introduced ultimately Warren. One is that because my dissertation was a story of Warren leading change, and Ken was my doctoral chairman, they met that way, but they really never met face to face and were collegial until we had formed the Ken Blanchard companies. And Warren, by that point, was, I think, probably at USC, and they connected face to face and became friends and colleagues. But
got it.
There were a couple other things I wanted to point out from that time that were, I think, Kate, instructive about who he was. I looked back at what he wrote about his job description as the president of the University of Cincinnati. And it was in 1972 when he wrote it. And it said, leadership is orchestrating inside and out. It's providing perspective about where we are and where we're going. It's creating awareness. He called it being alert to external forces and opportunities, which is why he loved Drea's dissertation. And then helping others be conscious of what was possible and moving them to action. I loved that perspective. Again, bringing people into awareness and then helping them be conscious of what was possible and then moving them to action, which is where my dissertation came in. There are a couple other things I wanted to mention. He was really clear about what his values were as president of the University of Cincinnati. And since this institute's going to be at Cincinnati, I thought it was important. He described them as visibility. And I was thinking, okay, so how is he visible? And I look back at some of my notes, and he wrote this thing called Candid Conversation. That was his newsletter. It was called Candid Conversation. And then he also talked a local television show into having something called the Bennis show on TV. I mean, again, he was all about creating visibility. And some people would probably criticize him and say it was visibility for him. I never thought it was that. I always thought it was visibility for the kinds of conversations we needed to be having. One of his values was informality, and he alluded to it as inclusivity, but one of his values was informality. And that's why the dinners were often at his home. Oh, he also set up his office. You walked into his office as you came in the door. His desk was right there so that you had to go around to sit and face him. His back was to the door to his office, and he faced out into the office. And mainly where you had conversations, where we watched him 90% of the time, was in what was right ahead of you when you came in the door, which is a set of comfortable couches and chairs. And people would just cluster around there. And of course, there was always 2 extra people in the room because we were there. But the way he set up his office was, again, informality. It's like, I'm not in charge. You're not coming in and going to sit opposite me at my desk. My desk is kind of behind you once you're into the office. And clearly the invitation was to sit in these chairs and couches and have conversation. And I just think it was really indicative of one of his values. And then the other 3 he wrote about is immediacy. He tried to get stuff done. And he wrote about openness. And again, that was openness to different perspective, to different points of view. And then his commitment to change, like my job at the University of Cincinnati is to lead change. And you have to remember, we were there in his sort of end of his second year. So we were there at the early part of his tenure, and we weren't there during all of the negotiations with the state and the moving of the university status. We weren't there for that huge change effort.
You saw what he was paving for that?
Mm-hmm. We did. Andrea particularly was focused on that. It was focused on, he had a police consortium. I mean, he just had all sorts of community groups who he opened up. Langsam, I think his name was, had been there for 20, 25 years. So he was sort of an institution, just like the university was an institution. And Warren created new relationships in the community, and made himself and the university seem more accessible, I think, which probably led to some of the negotiations, although we didn't follow it that far.
And did you want to talk more about the gifts? Did you finish because those are so interesting to me when you said his values, visibility and informality, immediacy, openness, commitment, but you also said that there were these gifts, and one of them was a conversation convener. And
a world-class noticer, focused always on possibility, which is why it was fun to watch him. My focus on my dissertation was how he led change. And I took 4 initiatives: how he led the university's commitment to affirmative action, how he led a bottom-up budget-making process, which is like, it was in vogue at that time. You got rid of anything that was a budget was like deconstructed, and you built it from the bottom up. And that was really revolutionary. It seemed to take away power from the deans, which didn't go down well. I focused on how he led strategic planning, which is the 3rd initiative. And then I focused on his commitment to leadership development, which is when he brought in all of his colleagues, all of his cronies, all of his co-authors to do these seminars. And so I looked at those 4 change initiatives. They were all basically internal change initiatives. Warren was brave. Not many people who were his colleagues, Edgar Schein or Benny and Chin, like, they didn't try to do it. They just wrote about it.
Right.
It's much different. Warren put himself on the line at Buffalo and then at Cincinnati to actually say, this is my leadership lab. Can I actually make it work? We won, Andrea and I won the National American Ethnographic Association award for our dissertations because we immersed ourselves. We were embedded in an organization. So we won that award, but we had built trust. So we could often see him on a collision course, particularly me, because people were talking to me because we held our ground rules so tightly that people could say, they were testing us all the time. They would say outrageous things to us, some of which were probably not true, but we wouldn't say anything. So they became more and more trusting. So we could see him so often on a collision course. We could say, oh God, if we could only intervene here, because you just have to have a little more sensitivity to that constituency, or that constituency is going to derail this whole initiative because they're not on board. They may be telling you they're on board, but they're not on board. But because we had such openness and we had it all on tape, we actually could confirm it, but that wasn't what we were going to share. So that's why I said it's
hard. That must have been hard to not be able to write.
It was hard because we were loyal to him.
Yeah.
The minute we broke trust, and one of Warren's big things is how you have to build trust. And we had done it. And then we would have broken it. The minute that it would have come back around, that he was acting in a different way because of something we said, or he brought up something he'd never brought up before with somebody that we had talked to, it was gone. We would have no access. So it was interesting.
When you guys had the conversation on the deck, what was he most upset about? Was there a certain piece of it?
I actually have his copy. So the copy I read has his notes scribbled in it. He was just feeling that I was holding him to impossible standards. And I tended to agree with him as I read back over it. I wanted him to be the perfect practitioner because I thought his theory was so strong. And it's theory that still influences me. I wanted it to work. And I didn't want to say didn't work because it was Warren. And I didn't want to say the theory was bad. I didn't want to say either of those things. And what I needed to have done, I think, is frame out more. It was a university and non-hierarchical, and administrators who were used to working with the same president for 25 years, and Warren being a very different profile of leader. Can I talk a little bit about the personal impact I had on me? Because clearly he was, outside of maybe Ken, the most important person in my life in terms of who I am and who I show up as and what I've written about. So
please, yes. Yes, we'd love to hear that.
He broadened our experience. Nobody gets to do a dissertation like this. I was at a university where they didn't require me to do any coursework. I was in the perfect university where there were no required courses at UMass. You crafted your own doctoral program, and you did it as eclectically and as uniquely. So my whole second year of my doctoral program was in Cincinnati for Aileen Warren. No classwork. I mean, that was just watching Warren. And then I came back and wrote for a year. So I only really had a year of classwork, and that was a multidisciplinary between the School of Education and the School of Business. And it was just the classes I picked to go. Warren, by putting us in this position, I got a chance to actually see firsthand all these people that I was reading about in my first year of graduate school. They were actually showing up at your house. And so he broadened my experience, and he gave me this opportunity by having me do this to observe and synthesize and write. He's the one who convinced me I was good at observation and good at synthesis and good at writing, all of which he was good at. So it was like I felt I had the perfect mentor, because those three skills of being able to be an observer, a synthesizer, like the work I did with you, Betsy, with the panels and selecting the who do we want as a president in 2008, and the ability to write, all of that was because he believed in me. He underlined that I could do those things. I think one of Warren's biggest gifts, and it's a gift that I think would be part of what you'd want to build into a curriculum, and I'm not exactly sure how you do it. He taught me to really know and trust my inner voice. So even though I may have been wrong on my conclusions about him, he's the one who said to me, if you're feeling this, it's a really good clue to how others are feeling. He's the one who, as we were sort of embedding ourselves in Cincinnati, it was like, I learned to trust my nose. I learned to trust my heart. I learned to trust my inner voice that said, things are good here. Ask some more questions. It doesn't feel right. So if I'm not feeling right, and I was an outsider, it's probably not feeling right for the insiders. And he's the one. That's been totally the way I worked my entire career in an organization. And totally, it's like I'd go in, and if it smelled rotten to me, it just felt rotten. It was rotten. And now I needed to ask more. Now I needed to follow that voice. And he was the one that got me. He drilled that into me. His writings on leading change influenced every career step I've taken. After I was with Warren and we moved to South Dakota, finished the dissertation, moved to South Dakota, came back to Ohio, to Miami of Ohio, where Drea was on the faculty, I joined a research team at the University of Texas to study why change efforts in schools fail. And my interest or passion for successful change came from wanting the theory to still work. And then this project was about why was so much money in federal money spent in educational improvement not improving education. Scores were going down, not up. And so it was Warren who created that passion in me for understanding why change efforts work or don't work. And he's influenced everything that I've ever written about leading change, which is one of Blanchard's core products is on leading change. And I think it's important that the students who are studying him now realize the importance he put on from the very beginning of hearing other people's voices. Warren was always about hearing other people's voices. That's why I meant he was at this conversation convener, but he did not believe you lead change top down. He believed you had to get other people on board. It's always getting their cooperation, hearing their voice, understanding it from their perspective, tapping into their collective wisdom, creating a shared vision. He always thought it was the leader's job to create the vision, but it was like, we have to share in this vision. I think it was one of the reasons he was disappointed in the strategic planning process at the university when he launched, and there were several things he could have done to have made it more successful. There are some things he could be faulted for there, but he didn't really feel like they came up with a shared vision that mobilized. They didn't talk to enough people. He didn't talk to them enough, but they didn't talk to enough people either. He was right about that. They didn't do a really broad-based, highly involving change process. And he was disappointed in their work. He always felt you had to create shared meaning. It had to be a shared vision. It had to have shared meaning. We had to see it from each other's point of view. He always felt like he was the person who was the catalyst. I'm going to get this thing rolling. But then it was rolling meant high involvement. And then my work has really been on high involvement change. The concepts that I've written about at Blanchard are top-down change doesn't work at all. And it's all about high involvement change. And that all comes straight from Warren. He's the person who introduced me to Kurt Lewin's work. And it was a couple of things that were important. Its framework of unfreezing, changing, and refreezing is the framework for my dissertation. And he was the one who introduced me to Kurt Lewin's work from the 40s. Lewin also wrote, and it really struck me when I read this sentence last week, is to really understand something, you have to try to change it. And Warren really understood the university because he tried to change it. And I think that's why he didn't go on to another university presidency. I think he realized like it's really hard to change these institutions. They're really, really, really hard. I think he learned about the culture, the tradition, the non-hierarchical organizational structure by being in it. It was a really hard organization to change. Warren's the person who introduced me to the concept of crucible moments. And maybe Noel spoke about that when you talked to Noel Tichy, but he was the one who said people have moments in their lives that change their life. I need to excavate those. I need to understand those in the people I'm working with and in myself. I think, Kate, though, it's so interesting is I looked and looked and looked last week to try to understand what were Warren's crucible moments, and I couldn't find his writing on them.
Did you read Still Surprised?
No.
That's his autobiography, really. It's his memoir. And in there, it's the first book where he talks about being 19 and marching into Germany in the infantry as a captain. And he talks about the University of Cincinnati, talks about his heart attack. I mean, he talks about his own personal crucibles there. It's his most personal book for sure.
I'll look at that because he's the one who talked to me about it. And he's the one who said leaders have to make meaning of them because that's what they bring to the moment of leadership. I knew about his service and the medals that he won. I knew about the disillusionment he experienced at Buffalo when the person who was Meyerson, I think, Meyerson left. Meyerson. I knew about the disillusionment at not being chosen at Northwestern. I knew about the heart attack, obviously. But I don't know if I could have said what was the meaning he made of all of those. He didn't write a lot about it. But his work on Crucible Moments has now shaped the leadership point of view work that I've done. So it's another piece of my writing, which is to say, what are the key people and events who influence your life? And out of that, what are your values? That's another program that I wrote for Blanchard. And it's the work it's the only piece of work outside of doing some work on situational leadership that I still do. So it's really the work to say, who are you at the moment of leadership? And tell me about those moments. And now how do we frame that into a statement you can make that helps accelerate how people know you in a leadership role? That's another tribute I give to him. And then he valued flexibility. You can't talk about Warren Bennis without talking about somebody who's incredibly adaptive and responsive and flexible. Great leadership, although you have to give the model itself that I've worked on for my whole life is situational leadership, and you have to give that to Ken. But Warren was the one who first taught me how to be adaptable, how to be flexible, how to pivot in the moment. The importance of leaders knowing how to do that. It's another really big gift. And he's still influencing me in some ways because I'm getting closer to retiring. I just read this week. I had never read it before, but his whole concept of retiring is transitioning. God, that felt so much more comforting. It's a period, and I love the words he used: redesigning, recomposing, and reinventing. The word that just pops to me is recomposing. What can I recompose here? So he still influences me as I prepared for this call.
Did you get that recomposing in the Geeks and Geezers book?
Yeah. I think that's where it was.
Yeah.
Who wrote the wonderful book, Composing a Life? It's a psychologist, Composing a Life. And he gave me that book. He loved it. He loved that term, composing. He loved words. I want to ask just briefly about my mom. Did you get to know her? Was she around? What was her influence on his leadership? Because Jack Fitzgerald, as a sophomore at the University of Cincinnati, he'd read Dad's book on becoming a leader in high school because he got punished, and his punishment was to read the book and write a paper in high school. And when he got to the University of Cincinnati, he started the Warren Bennis Leadership Experience, which was a student-run organization that still does this, that's going to be doing it on April 6th. They're still running. And his original idea for this was the Warren and Clary Bennis Leadership Institute, because he thought everybody who he met talked about Mom and her presence in Dad's role. I'm just curious to see, was she around?
She was around, Kate, but in that intense year that we were there, we were so focused on Warren. And she was such in the background with you and your two brothers. It was like, there was a gracefulness, a graciousness being in your house, a sense of welcoming that I always attributed to your mom, not to your dad. Your dad was a convener in the space. He architected the event, but your mom created the space by which the conversations could occur. I didn't have great visibility to her. It wasn't my focus at all. And I never even, when I went back over my notes, it never even occurred to us to interview her, which is, again, kind of like, what? Why?
Sign of the times, though, right? Sign of the times.
So I was 1972. What have other people said? I'd be curious. What have other people you've interviewed said about Clary?
One is someone we haven't interviewed yet. She was my mom's closest friend, Diane Fishbein. And when Mom was at Cincinnati, we'll see her in Cincinnati when we are there. I'll introduce you. And she was very clear about Mom's influence, but it really had to do with that piece of creating the space for kind of magical things to happen. And that was her gift. She created an ease about things. She wanted everything to be very easy. She had someone put in 2 stoves in our kitchen because she said, I don't want to have to cook for 100 people with 1 stove. And she made things very simple. She made a soup usually and a salad and had great crusty bread and said, that's dinner. Right. She just made everything easy so that she could really be hands-free and be present. She loved people so much. She was a great listener. So that's the kind of story that they would tell about her. There's some great stories that Charles Handy told about her in Boston, actually, when he first met my parents, that she had a party, and he'll tell the story where all she did was she handed out paper cups and you got champagne and soup, cabbage soup in paper cups. I've got a funny story that may have nothing to do with anything, but when Dad was giving an honorary degree to Eppie Lederer, who was Ann Landers, twin sister of Dear Abby, right? Eppie Lederer marched into the kitchen and said to my mom, why are you making a homemade soup when you have KFC at the bottom of the hill? You take KFC chicken and you put marmalade on it, and it's the best meal ever. And Mom thought, that's brilliant.
I love that description of your mom. She created ease. She did create space in your house for these even bigger and more yet intimate conversations to happen. It was uncomplicated. I remember it was never about the food. It was never about the setting. It was just the comfort of being in your house. And it was easy. Ease was a really good word. Grace was also a really good word. It was just, there was graciousness about it. You asked the question about what were his lasting and relevant leadership lessons. And there were 5 that just sort of jumped out at me. I think the one that came to mind before I looked at anything else was the whole notion of balancing action and reflection. It's the theory. He was always the person who taught me, no matter how much you're into it, leading others, you have to step back and look at what is happening here. So that value of stepping back and taking stock. And it was really to tap in, I think, to know how you knew yourself, your values, your truth, because in the complex leadership situations you would encounter, you had to know who you were at that moment of leadership. What was your, like Bill George's work, what is your true north? What is your truth? I think Warren knew it. And his clarity about what people want. I think he's always been right. Whether he could always give them what he wanted or create the environment that they could get what they wanted, that's what's so hard. He was always clear that people want to feel significant. They want to do purposeful work. I mean, he always talked about trust. You have to have trust. He always, I think, felt that people get things done with a sense of optimism. He was never a pessimist. He had daunting challenges in front of him. He was never pessimistic. He was always optimistic. And I think he felt people did better in community, in teams. The work he did on, was it Organizing Genius? Like the book, the idea of deep collaboration. People want exciting work and purposeful work, but they also want to feel like they're doing it with others now. And I think he's right. There's some work, on motivation now saying people's ARC, autonomy, connectedness, and relationships. He was onto that 50 years ago, that people need to do purposeful work together. I loved the writing he did on the competencies leaders need. If you had to distill what Warren said, the competencies leaders need, it's the ability to manage attention, focus, the ability to manage meaning. And he was always trying to make meaning of leadership experience. You had to manage trust and you had to manage yourself. It didn't get any more elemental than that. It's core truth. So now I don't know what a university does or a program at Cincinnati does to teach those competencies: manage attention, manage meaning, manage trust, and manage self. I have better ideas on how to manage self, but I don't have really good ideas on how you do the others.
One other thing was the context, right?
And then managing context. Yeah. Part of that would be come under meaning, I think. What do you have to pay attention to, be alert to in the environment? And what is the meaning we make of it? I think he would subsume that there, but he was the first person that taught me that leaders aren't orchestra leaders, but jazz musicians. I loved it. To this day, I wish I'd come up with that. He had a phrase: listening to and acting on the sounds around them. And for the sounds, that was the voices. Listening to and acting on the sounds around him, which is what a jazz musician does. And he called it a jazz musician, not a jazz band leader. But he was like, they're not orchestra leaders, they're jazz band musicians. Because that notion of equity, that every one of them in a jazz band becomes the leader at some point in time. They take the music and they create, and then others make them look better. And then it shifts. And that is the heart of who I think Warren is.
Everything that we were saying about Warren, like the things that he believed 50 years ago, are all true today.
I know.
That's
it is
amazing about it.
What are his lasting leadership contributions? I think those are them. They're true, like you said, Betsy, today.
Oh, when he was talking about self-knowledge, that was way before. Right now, self-knowledge is such a like cool thing. Everyone's talking about self-knowledge, right? But that was very like nobody was talking about.
It was like
very edgy.
Exactly. And that's why I think one of the change initiatives I followed was in putting people into leadership development. These are academic deans. They got promoted because they were really good at medicine. So they were the dean of the medical school, or really good as an educator. So they were the dean of the school of education. But his notion was, no, you're a leader. So now you have to develop your leadership. And part of that, putting these people that were his colleagues in front of his administrative staff, was to help them understand who they were at the moment of leadership. Any leadership development program that Cincinnati's going to orchestrate has to create deep self-knowledge. People have to be put in situations where they have to see who they are, whether that's simulation or T group, Warren's early work. There has to be immersive learning experiences to teach people about themselves.
The University of Cincinnati has a really great co-op program. So the kids are in the workplace early and taking leadership roles, and they get to try out a lot of what they're learning in the classroom in the real world, which is amazing to have that built into the system.
Exactly.
What are the key components that you think should be included in any kind of curriculum on leadership? And I can tell you that self-knowledge is one that every single person we've interviewed has said. Isn't that interesting, Betsy?
Self-knowledge.
Yeah, so interesting.
Self-knowledge and context.
Yeah.
Experiential learning is a big part of it. And
I would say it has to be cohort based. I was thinking of my son-in-law's MBA at Texas. He didn't get an individual grade the entire time he was at the University of Texas 2-year program. It was always a group-based grade. What that meant
That's
is
so
you had to pay
interesting.
attention. You had to pay attention to everybody else. He was the weakest person on your team. To this day, he's really good at collaboration. He's really good at making sure that everyone is speaking up and doing their share and being heard. I think that's one thing that occurred to me. Emotional intelligence has to be part of it. And I think it's a little different than self-knowledge. There's self-regulation and self-knowing that comes under self-knowledge. But I think that notion of how to use self-regulation, Warren regulated himself a lot by smoking. He would have a cigarette instead of talking, and it became his way of moderating because he would love to comment. I know he would have. I think teamworking or collaboration skills is an important piece of it, working together. And change leadership. Warren's works, like you said, Betsy, 50 years ago, 60 years ago on change leadership are good. They're really strong. And I try to keep up on the field of change leadership. Nobody jumps out at me as like, oh God, that's the person we have to be following now. I'm a pragmatist. I am about what is a skill I can teach a leader in a few-day program, not write about it necessarily. But mine has all been about high involvement change. You look at what is and you create the vision of what can be together. You build the change plan together. You look for the people who are early adopters and you focus the hell on them, and you don't focus on resistance. Warren taught me a lot about, you don't pay attention to the resistors, you pay attention to the advocates. You give all the advocates the attention because those are the people who are with you. Warren would never be a person who would write about how do you tap down resistance. It would be you go to the resistors and you learn from them, but you also don't give them too much. Pay attention to the advocates. The concept we use in our work, and I think it probably came from Warren, is when you initiate a change, there's 20% who are for you, 20% who are against you, and most of the people are undecided. They haven't made up their mind. So focus on the advocates who will convince the undecideds if you create enough conversation. And listen to the resistors, but don't give them too much credit.
When do you think you have the most promise of having real change happen in their leadership? What do you think it is that really helps them change and become better leaders?
I think one of the things is the leadership point of view work, when they really understand who they are at the moment of leadership and what's been important to them, what's their life narrative. I've seen some people really change as a result of writing that life story and realizing that Warren always push limits on being vulnerable. But most managers aren't vulnerable. They're buttoned up. And so whenever somebody becomes, I think, more vulnerable, they create connection, they create a sense of belonging, they create a sense of trust, partnership. I'm more like you than I thought I was, a benefit of a doubt. So I think that work transforms. I was thinking one manager who was really negative. I think he was Swedish. I met him at one of the big Fortune 50 companies, and he was not in the high potential work that I was doing, but he was one of the sponsors. So he had to do his leadership point of view as one of the people who would demonstrate what a leadership point of view was. And he did it kicking and screaming. He did not like doing it. But when he then went on to be a CEO of a big multinational Australian-based firm, he called me up and he said, okay, I think we should do the leadership point of view work with all my new team. And so he had me coach 8 people who, there were maybe 3 that came from the old company and 5 that were going to be new, including him. And that was a significant amount of time because it takes a while to get people to open up and to document it and to really dig at what their values are. And then he used that as a springboard to set the organization's values or to reset them, because he said, let's find where the 8 people who are going to lead this organization, at least for the next 5 years. Let's find where the intersections are of our values and what we're going to drive together, because it's much more natural. That was a place. And then we, out of that, created a vision and values statement for the organization. He rolled it out in Warren Bennis would have been proud of how he rolled it out. It was very collaborative. It was like a series of conversations. So that was a good example of a leader who I thought, in a real company, used self-knowledge and used the importance of doing mission, vision, and values work at the very top of the organization, but socializing it in high involvement. He was the one who taught me it's not going to go glossy. Now that's kind of an outdated term these days because nobody prints anything anyway, but we weren't going to make it into a marketing brochure. it was only going to be in Word until 1,000 people had looked at it. So in other words, it was influenceable. If I get a Word document, I can do track changes. Those words aren't glossy yet. We don't have $10,000 in a marketing piece that we're sending to all employees in the company. Magnus's name was, he kept things not glossy. He kept them in Word forever so that people felt they could influence.
That's wonderful. That sense of being influenceable and influenced is great.
What I think from what people doing that life journey, what is it from doing that do you think is the shift that he had?
I think the key events piece of it that we ask gets at crucible moments, like turning points or turning chapters. I think the key people gets at gratitude. It gets at who were the people who significantly influenced my values or my point of view, and how did they do that? How did that happen? And then I think just teasing out, what is the values? What do you mean by that? What is that really? Warren's values are clear. They were always clear. Visibility, openness, commitment to change, informality. They were always clear.
Yeah. It's interesting. Do you think that a lot of leaders don't know that?
I don't think they know what their values are now. I think they adopt the corporate speak values. I can't tell you how many values I hear first. I value teamwork. And that's like, yeah, that doesn't make the list. What does it really mean? How does it show up? What would it be if you were acting as a team member, team leader, or not acting? They're just the pushing and pulling at that. I think the tugging at that is really
And sharing.
important.
Sounds like it, and sharing with each other, right?
Yeah, it's Noel Tishy's work. It's clearly his work, and it's Bill George's work. They've both gone on and done significant pieces of work in this notion of leadership point of view, or which is what we call it, or true north, or
yeah.
Can I tell you the whole thing about the cohorts? You're the first person who's brought that up. I had a teacher in college who was from Africa, and he said, in Africa, if one person in a class fails, the whole class fails. And everyone was upset by that. They're like, but I do all the hard work, and why should I, blah, blah, blah. It was a transformative class for me because of that. And I actually wrote a blog post about it, about real teamwork, that we are beholden to everybody. And what you're right about that, that's an in the classroom kind of training that literally in real time teaches leadership.
Exactly. And you have to
so
deal
brilliant
with issues like that. What if people don't carry their weight? Well, what do leaders have to deal with all the time?
Right, all the time.
And then they have to look at it, is it lack of clarity of expectation, or is it lack of performance management skills, feedback?
Someone you delegate, and someone's doing everything and they're overworked, and all of that.
One more thing is teaching others how you take others' perspective. Warren was always good at hearing other people's voices. So how do you take someone else's perspective? And I don't know how you teach that, but sometimes you think about the old debate programs. You had to argue a point of view that wasn't necessarily your own. There's some really good creative problem solving things where you have to, techniques where we used them in Blanchard. It's called De Bono's 5-hat thinking, I think it's called. And there's one point in a 5-hat creative problem solving process where you have to argue somebody else's point of view. And I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do. Like, I don't want to argue your point of view. But it's amazing how you get to common ground really quickly. And you really acknowledge that you heard their perspective and their point of view to the point where they're satisfied that you heard it.
That is also a key point. Yes.
We have to get people to be other focused. So that's the skills like of empathy and emotional intelligence and communication skills. Warren was always optimistic. It was always about possibility. What can change versus what can't change.
Our last question was, what do you think the world needs now from Dad? I think you just answered that question. It needs optimism and hope and a sense of possibility, and stop whining and don't pay attention to the naysayers and take action and move forward. Thank you so much, Pat.